Okay, good. We're live. Hooray. Hello and welcome everyone for joining us for an evening with Meredith Talusan and Cyrus Dunham. I'm Rakesh Satyal. I'm the Vice President of the Board of Lambda Literary, and I'm thrilled to be your host tonight for another installment of Lambda Literary Does Pride, a series of readings and discussions with a few of our community's brightest stars. To see our full list of events, visit our website at lambdaliterary.org. Books have always been central to queer culture and identity, which is why I am so proud of the work that Lambda Literary does. Many of you might be familiar with the Lambda Literary Awards, which celebrate the best LGBTQIA+ books of the year. Since 1989, the Lammies have asserted the distinct value and power of queer literature. The Lammies are just one part of our work, however. Lambda Literary also brings LGBTQIA+ books into schools so that kids, especially queer and trans youth, can see themselves reflected in the books they read in school. We also prepare future generations of queer writers by offering the only writing residency in the world exclusively for emerging LGBTQIA+ writers. These programs and others are only possible because of financial support from people like you, which is why I ask that you make a donation to Lambda Literary tonight by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Like many people and organizations, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an enormous impact on us, and this June, we need to raise $25,000 to continue our work throughout the year ahead. Please help us ensure that Lambda Literary can continue to respond creatively and powerfully as we move through this tumultuous time. Even giving as little as $10 ensures that we can keep bringing you programs like tonight's in the months and years ahead. With that, I will introduce tonight's guests. Cyrus Dunham is the author of A Year Without a Name. He lives in Los Angeles, where he is a member of the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and the DROP LWOP Coalition. Meredith Talusan is an award-winning author and journalist who has written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, Wired Self, and Condé Nast Traveler, among other publications, and has contributed to several essay collections. She received awards from GLAAD, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association. She is also the founding executive editor of THEM, Condé Nast LGBTQ+ digital platform, where she is currently contributing editor. Her wonderful debut memoir, Fairest, was released in May. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming our wonderful guests, Meredith and Cyrus. So I will go away. They will read for a few minutes each. They'll have a discussion. I will reappear at the end to say goodbye to all of you. But thank you so much to both of you for being here. We're truly grateful, and have a wonderful event. Thanks so much.
Hooray. Thank you so much, Rakesh.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Cyrus.
Hi, Meredith. I'm so excited to be here and getting to, this is the first time we've gotten to do a reading / conversation with one another. That was just the two of us.
I know.
I just admire your work so much, and I feel like we love a lot of the same people and have known each other for a while, but hopefully this is the first of many times that we get to converse.
Yes, but the first time is always the most exciting. Well, maybe not always the most exciting, but definitely a very exciting time.
And it's funny because today we were emailing about what to basically discuss, and Meredith was just like, maybe we should just read and talk about sex. Or something. You did a more kind of elegant version of that.
Well, no, just because the way that you frame sex in your book was so delicious and fascinating, and also just sort of like indicative of so many of the ways that you think, so many of the ways that I got so much insight from your book. So apparently you're gonna read to me something.
I'm gonna go first, and I am gonna say just before I read that I've actually been following Meredith's writing for a really long time. I remember even I read articles you wrote maybe 7 or 8 years ago on Medium, and I remember thinking, like, who is this person, Meredith Talusan, who is writing about politics and gender and race and ideological conflict with such nuance? And I had such like a writer crush, even like when you would publish your articles on your Medium page. And I'm just so excited that your book is in the world, and that the nuance and complexity of what you do is something that more and more people are going to be able to access. I think it's really important, especially right now. Some other time I'll tell you all the articles that I read that were
all right.
Yeah, so I'm gonna read briefly from a new piece that I've been working on that has not been published yet. And I've also like barely shared it. I sort of shared some of it in a small reading a few months ago. So it's always nerve-wracking to share things that haven't been edited and haven't really seen the light of day. But I was like, why not for Lambda share a piece that's kind of like vulnerable and unformed and about my deepest desires and pained sexuality and gender problems, you know?
Right.
And so just like a heads up to people, it is graphic, and I talk really specifically about genitalia. And I want to just kind of start by saying that I come to my writing and my life with a really strong belief that the genitalia we have has no correlation to our gender identity or our biological sex. In fact, I don't even believe in biological sex. But in this piece, I'm trying to work through the ways that we still have desires shaped by these constructs. And so I might be using words like cock and penis in a way that is correlated with masculinity for the purposes of my trans identity, but that is not connected to larger beliefs that I have about how genitalia structures our world. Okay, so with that, I'm going to just read briefly. There's this young white man, and he's on his knees. His left hand is holding himself up, and his right hand is cradling another boy's head. He's thrusting his penis in and out of the other boy's mouth. He's fucking the boy's face. His dick is too big for him, in a way, and so are his hands, like a puppy that trips over its own paws. The way he's fucking the other boy's face is sort of jerky. It looks like work. And he's doing it like he's being watched, assessed, like he hasn't done this much, but wants to seem like he knows what he's doing. And he is being watched, originally by a camera, but now by me. I study his effort, how his eyes dart around, how he presses his tongue into the left corner of his mouth. He squints his eyes when his penis goes all the way down the other boy's throat. When the whole thing seems like it takes the most effort, he flares his nostrils too. I have this idea that if I had a cock, one I was born with, I would wake up alone, jerk off, and wipe the cum off my stomach. Then I'd drink a cup of coffee, and I wouldn't need to make the bed. I'd walk to work and grab a bagel with cream cheese at the deli. Instead, I always make the bed. I always make the bed. I miss this version of me, the version of me that doesn't make the bed. How can a person miss someone they never were? How can a person miss something they never had? Firstly, in this missing, having is an alternate form of being. Secondly, it's as if I do know what it's like to have the thing I want. I feel it. I feel all of it. The feeling is total and known because I had it, and the memory of the thing I had that I do not have stays with me. The approximation of the thing, any attempt at approximating the thing, makes the absence of what I don't have hurt more. The question I'm asking is something like this. How are our desires produced? By the very processes we hope will fulfill them. Why do I want what I want? Where did my want come from, and why is it so huge? And, of course, what does this wanting feel like? What am I supposed to do with this wanting? Am I supposed to get what I want or try to want something different? Am I attached to wanting without having? Is the absence who I am? Does this want keep me disciplined? Does this want defy discipline? Does this want make me a man? Does this want mean I'll never be a man? I used to want a flat chest more than to look like a man. Then I had a flat chest and I started to look like a man. Now I want a cock I was born with more than to look like a man. But what I have is looking like a man, not a cock I was born with. The site of the want moved. It's bodily and localized. Procedures and treatments, they help us train the want, try to pin it down. But for some of us, it travels into other parts of our body, other challenges. Wanting is the thing that we are. So what I want to talk about is the feeling of wanting, the pleasure of wanting, wanting as being, wanting as a way of existing, not a wanting that can be corrected. Perhaps there's no fixing the wanting, no filling the hole, the psychic one, the genital one. One might wonder why I want so badly when I have, but this is not the stuff of wanting. Want cannot be convinced away. Want becomes us, becomes who we imagine ourselves to be, who we are, and who we will never be again. I can't tell if the boy in the video, with his dick in the other boy's mouth, is happy. Maybe he's satisfied because he's doing something he thinks he's supposed to be doing, which is fucking a mouth. Maybe when there's a mouth wrapped around your penis and two hands drenched in saliva wrapped around the shaft, extending the mouth, and you're holding the face right where you want it with your puppy paw, and you're manipulating the head until it gags, maybe then it doesn't matter whether it's the mouth of a boy or a girl or a man or a teenager. It's just a mouth, and you have the thing you want.
Amazing.
Let's just leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. Okay. I'm gonna read without much qualification because I think that some of the resonances are gonna be obvious. So I'm reading first from a section. You know, the book is the book Fairest is divided into 3 sections, and the second section is during my undergraduate years at Harvard. And the specific section is about just sort of like my relationship with my first boyfriend, whose name was Thomas. And yeah, so I think that's what you need to know. During my summer internship between sophomore and junior year, I learned in the mosquito-ridden lawns of the Berkshire Theatre Festival that I had no patience for the petty politics of the stage, as I observed behind-the-scenes dramas that negated everything I loved about the shows I saw. The only enjoyable parts were the late-night parties with the crew and supple dances with Alan, the prop master, encounters that extended to his bed. I should have called Thomas. Oh, and yes, I was a gay man at the time. How did you know that? Okay. That's important, I guess. I should have called Thomas and told him it was over, but Alan lived in New Jersey during the year, so we made no sense apart from dancing close, a compatibility that reminded me of entangled wrestling spiders in bed, the joy of one wrapping another in silk, sensual yet suffocating. Maybe this was what sex would be like until I had more experience. My spirit not quite at one with my body, the ending a relief from getting disentangled instead of the transcendent pleasure I'd been promised. I returned to school determined to tell Thomas about the affair and break up with him, but he was so eager to see me that I couldn't, though maybe that was just cover for the ego boost he provided, the knowledge that I was the center of another person's world. He lived in a high-floor apartment on Beacon Street, just after the bridge, with expansive views of the Charles from his living room window, which was probably what I liked most about him. What he liked most about me, it turned out, was that I fit into his fantasies of nabbing a twink despite being a nerd. In his apartment late one night, shortly after I got back from the Berkshires, I got out of bed to use the bathroom and found him awake when I returned. Just stay there, he said. I want to look at you. Thomas turned on his bedside lamp, and I felt the light unclothe me. I stood still for a few seconds before Thomas got up himself and asked me to turn toward the full-length mirror beside his bed, oak-framed and propped up on a stand. I like watching myself, he said. I always thought the mirror felt incongruous in that sparsely furnished room, and it was only then that I understood its function. Thomas stood behind me and massaged my torso, his chin propped up against my shoulder. I felt like a lifeless toy. For a moment, I thought he would try to jerk me off, and I wondered how far my tolerance went. But thankfully, he instead stepped from behind me to stroke himself. It's like we're porn stars, he said. And I reached for my own penis because I knew this is what he wanted. Looking at Thomas's scrawny body in the mirror, I began to understand that we weren't so dissimilar, that we both wanted to be desired. But somehow, being with me fueled his fantasies, and as I observed our bodies, I gained even more evidence of my high place among the rungs of attractiveness. Marvin, this guy I hooked up with from in a porn theater in Times Square, told me I needed to enjoy being young and blonde, and I responded to that call by getting Thomas, sleeping with Alan. But it was in that mirror, witnessing firsthand how another man projected his fantasies onto my body, that I came to a concrete understanding of my beauty's worth. Yet I also felt a visceral repugnance at being merely the surface of Thomas's lurid fantasies, at myself for recognizing his desire to be beautiful as my own, how I too would want to see myself in the mirror with a man who was my better physical ideal if I had the chance. But there was something else. Looking at my image, smooth skin on a naturally slim body, the toned slopes of gym-defined muscles, I realized that the only way for me to go further up those rungs of desire was to fill out my body so I could become broader and more masculine. But even though I wanted to feel my most attractive, to have hordes of men falling at my feet, I realized how the body that could achieve this outcome was not the body I wanted. Can we finish in bed? I asked, and Thomas relented. I turned off the light, and darkness once again wrapped itself around me. I wondered if Thomas saw my naked body in his mind when he brought me to climax with his mouth, while I only felt sensation.
That was so beautiful.
Thank you.
So sexy and yes, there are really interesting parallels in the pieces that we read.
Yeah, and you know, like honestly, reading it's just kind of like this fascinating thing where when you read a writer who is working in, you know, like in territory that is similar to yours, right? And then sort of like realizing, I don't know, like the differences in modes, and sort of, you know, like for me, like I asked myself, what would it be like to have, you know, that more sort of like, I feel like you have this sort of, this voice that's like analyzing what's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of like a commentary there. And, you know, like I'm fascinated by that mode. I guess like that's one of my first questions, like, how did you, I guess, you know, like both in your work now and in your book, just sort of like develop that voice and develop that idea of, you know, sort of like, it almost seems like, you know, like you're telescoping back and forth as you're narrating these scenes.
Well, I wanted to ask you something similar, so it'll be a good crossover, but because I'm really curious how you approached it. I mean, one of the things I've always cherished about memoir or life writing or whatever you want to call it is the way in which, like, when we allow ourselves to write about our lives, we can submit to the voice in our head that we often try to suppress.
Yeah.
And I think I've really tended towards dissociation and a sort of like analytical dissociation where my life is happening, but don't feel as if I'm in it, but I feel as if I'm watching it. And maybe that's trauma, maybe that's astrological. I really don't know, but you know, it's like such an intense struggle for me is to experience my life in an embodied sensation-based way. And there's something about writing in that voice, letting myself like sort of submitting to that voice that's both really healing and sort of helps me exercise it and then be more present. And then also, yeah, I think I just made a decision with my book and with first person writing since then that I was going to try to like let my internal voice at its most sort of obsessive, analytical, sort of like maybe the qualities I don't even like about myself, that I was going to kind of let that out. And so I did want to ask you how much in sort of, because you do write in a lot of different, I've experienced you to write in different modes, you know, even if it's often within the frame of nonfiction, one has to use a very different voice to do certain forms of like journalistic reporting than to do cultural criticism, and also you're hilariously funny, and that has come out in a lot of your writing. And And I was really curious, like how much work you had to do to decide on the voice that you were going to use in Fairest, or if it was like how, and if that resonates for you at all, this idea of allowing your inner monologue to like be expressed outward.
Yeah, I think that I did make a concrete decision. I remember at the beginning of this process where I, the two forms that I was thinking about is the form of the essay, or the sort of like the memoir as expanded essay. Like an example that I can think of is definitely Between the World and Me.
Right.
Quotes. In certain ways, K.S.A. Lehman's Heavy is also written that way. Or do I want to write the sort of novelistic memoir that is, sort of like narrative and scene-based? And I think that I decided on the latter in part because I was doing so much of the former, that I just sort of felt like I spent so much time sort of analyzing, especially with personal essays that I was writing. Usually they had some sort of topical peg, right? So usually it's sort of like I'm relaying this experience to you in relationship to something that's happening in the news. And I'm going to then, use whatever's happening in the news to analyze that experience so that you can understand trans people better. And I think that it became, having done that for a number of years, it became kind of important for me to be able to relay my experiences on their own terms. But at the same time, I sort of knew intuitively that, like an important engine for people when you do that, to keep reading rather than just sort of like organizing things in terms of vignettes, that people really enjoy narrative, right? And really enjoy sort of like seeing how the sort of expanses of time connect together. I think that's how that voice developed. And then what's really interesting, like talking to you about dissociation and talking to you about that mode, is that in a lot of ways, I am also the person who always has like the observing eye, like when I'm in bed, right? I'm kind of like, I'm simultaneously myself and an anthropologist outside of myself a lot of the time. And so I kind of became, like in a way I shifted in the other direction where I became obsessed with, like with just being like, okay, like how did that feel, right? Like you remember the details of it and the facts of it, but it was actually really fascinating to try to just sort of like dig in and excavate those memories, right? And just find these, just find these details that I didn't really think about until I actually, like over a period of, like several drafts, like more and more of the picture emerged, right? Oh, and by the way, people, if you have questions for us, we're supposed to remind you that there's an ask a question thingy down there somewhere. And please do ask us questions, but I'm totally happy to. I have an infinite number of questions.
I do too. You're very good. You're a very good MC.
But I figured we should, like we should remind people that if they have questions, they can ask. And I think like the other aspect of the way that, you write sex scenes or like sex incidents in your book that just really fascinated me is the sort of question of like, how do you situate the importance of body parts while at the same time, giving the reader an understanding that it's not because of the, like those physical parts themselves necessarily, but what they represent, right? Which I feel like we're aligned in that
deeply.
in that sense, right? That it's not, like for me in the book, the thing that I talk about a lot is that, it's not necessarily the body part itself, the vagina itself in my case, but it's the way in which the vagina has been situated historically, the way in which, that when I read books, the way that I'm encouraged to fantasize about the characters in those books are for them to be embodied in specific ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was that?
Well, I mean, I feel like deeply aligned with you about that. And I think, I mean, it feels in many ways to me violent, sometimes even say a word like penis or vagina, because I fear that in saying it, I'm like affirming its existence as this static thing that looks a certain way. When in fact, we know people have this, it looks so many ways, even among people who identify as cis, and these things are constructed. But, and this is something I come up against so much with sex and gender, is that, we can analytically and historically and structurally understand how these systems have been created, but we're still living in them, and so they still shape what we want and what we lust after, what we compare ourselves to. And I think in this essay I'm working on, I think it's also very different to for me to describe a different person's body using these specific words, and that requires a different conversation and a different consideration of what it means to them. But in this essay, I was like, okay, I'm gonna just give myself permission to try to explore the imaginary cock, penis, whatever you want to call it, that haunts my life. And the way in which that desire can kind of grow bigger and bigger and bigger, while also deepening my belief of the ways in which it's artificial, but it's also, I mean, something in the excerpt you read that I thought was so beautiful is and that really resonated for me as well, from the ways I had sex when I was passing as a cis person or something, is how much of sex is also seeing yourself through another person's eyes. And that, even as a person who was, living as a woman but didn't feel like one, I could get myself to the place where just watching these parts of my body that I had no sensual relationship to be lusted after by someone else was this erotic experience in and of itself. And it's confusing because I want to ask you so many questions about writing, but then I obviously want to ask you all these questions about your deep beliefs about the body. But I'm trying to think a lot at this phase in my life about do I even know what sex means to me? Do I even know what I want outside of trying to experience being seen, and trying and chasing some feeling, and increasingly, chasing the feeling of feeling masculine in relation to another. That's where a lot of the dissociation comes in too, is just how hard it is. I sit around sometimes being so there are people for whom things just feel incredibly good, and they just chase this feeling, trying to imagine what it would be like to be in your body in that way.
I do think about the fact that, one of the things that people talk about, or, that express surprise about, right, is how, comfortable I apparently communicate my experiences around sex during that period in my life, even though there is some communication of, discomfort around being male-bodied, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think that, when I think about that, I do feel like it has something to do with growing up in a culture and an environment where children are not nearly as gendered as they are in the States, just because in the Philippines, essentially, like in Filipino indigenous culture, you don't really become gendered until you reach a stage where you have to marry, right? So all of the terms, like, there are no gendered pronouns, but also like all of the terms for children are gender neutral, right? So you don't say son or daughter, you just say child, or or you don't say nephew or niece, you just say nibbling, would be the neologism now.
Yeah.
And I feel like I grew up not really having the sense that having a penis somehow like negates my femininity, or like negates some fundamental part of what it means for me to also, desire to be feminine. And that's something that I've observed as distinct in terms of the way that I'm kind of like emotionally made up, right? That when I because I did medically transition, I had bottom surgery. The way that I felt about it was not, I hated this body part, like I want a new one. But it was more like, oh, like this one's okay, but I think, it'll be better, right? And I think, and I don't know, yeah. So that was something that did strike me about your book, like, and the sort of like differences between our experience.
I'm curious how you decided in the writing of your book how much to sort of write through and divulge the way you thought through, get a medicalized trans process and things like bottom surgery, because it's really difficult, as a trans writer, to be like, these are huge questions in my life that deeply shape my experience, and also I know that the consumption of transness deeply also wants to read about how we relate to our genitals,
right.
And how to balance the fact that like we know that that's what people want, because because we know that when people hear trans, the first thing they think of is genitalia,
right?
And I'm curious how you decided how much to give and share.
I think for me, really, the way that I framed the book to myself was that I'm interested in telling my story to myself, right? Because of the fact that, so many of these events were happening, these were periods in my life where I didn't really have a lot of time to introspect. And so my guiding principle was that, like, is this something that I'm interested in exploring and discovering? And in the process of doing that, like, there are times when I talk about my genitals because I'm interested in my genitals in this particular way, right? Like I was really interested, like there's a scene in the book where I have sex with somebody who says that, like they don't really have sex with men, right? And I sensed this way about them, this way of being, and this way of being with me, where that felt true to me in a way that was super sort of activating and erotic, right? But I kind of held the reader at bay in certain ways, right? Like what I was describing was my experience. And then, and then in the process of doing that, an outside reader might find it interesting because I find it interesting. But if it wasn't interesting to me, like for instance, I was so much more interested in all of the decision-making processes that led up to bottom surgery rather than bottom surgery itself. I was not one of those people who, like I've had friends who've obsessed about, like every medical detail. I just was not one of those people. I read about a surgeon who had a good reputation, and so I did it. And I actually do compare bottom surgery in the book to a nose job, right? Because that's how I ultimately felt about it, right? Is that the reason why it's important to people is because of the way that our society has built up the significance of, of these body parts. But essentially, you're doing the same thing. Like, you're modifying a body part while maintaining, its function, right? So yeah, so that was sort of how I conceived it. And I think that's sort of related. I had, this brings up like this other question of, did you have issues around sort of like telling a non-allowed or like a non-sanctioned version of your transition? Like I feel like around, for instance, like around your name, right? Like, it's something that was really striking to me, the way in which, like, you really unpack your attachment to your previous name in this way that, that is like, that kind of like runs counter to the trans narrative of, like, oh, my old name is dead, I never want to,
And it's so funny because, I did the naughty thing that probably no writer should do, which is look at some of the Goodreads reviews. And there were so many people being like, this person, I don't think this person's actually trans, like,
oh goodness, yeah,
right, which is like, there's this, which I think is really interesting. I'm like, maybe if you have a really specific idea of what that means that you're attached to in order to believe that it's a valid experience, maybe I'm not that thing, right. But I think, and it's tough because I probably wouldn't write the same book now that I wrote then, but at that time I wrote it for some reason. I made the decision to write this book during this incredibly tumultuous process for me, and it's much more a document of a process than it is any form of a resolved kind of look back at what took place. Right. And so the result of that is that there's like a lot of doubt and a lot of fear, and a lot of making decisions and then questioning the decisions. And so I just thought that I really wanted to honor that, and share that, and that in some way it would have been meaningful to me to read, to understand at an earlier point in my life that it's okay to make these decisions that the world tells us are really massive and still be unsure of them and still question them and still doubt them. And like, it's actually okay to just do things because you think it's the best thing that you can do in that moment. And, I feel even differently. I feel pretty clear on using the name Cyrus now, but at the end of the book, I was really going back and forth, and I was experiencing a lot of grief and confusion about whether I had almost like betrayed myself or not. There was this way in which the earlier named version of myself almost started to seem like another person, and I couldn't tell whether it was my job to protect her or whether in not using that name I was harming her. It got very psychologically confusing. And I think that a lot of people who are skeptical of transness would see that as evidence of a reason not to transition, or as evidence of mental illness or something like that. And I'm curious what you think about this, but, I am really interested in sort of like troubling the way in which we are always trying to assert that transness is not a mental illness because of the history of transness being understood as a mental illness, because I'm like, I don't even necessarily buy into the ways in which mental illness is often stigmatized and conceived of in our world. And so even though it was kind of scary, I was like, maybe I'm going to try to be honest about, even if I feed into the narrative that like all trans people are crazy, that maybe is okay, and maybe that's going to reach the people. Not okay, but you know what I mean. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, the thing is, right, like this whole question of craziness and mental illness, it just can't be separated from the way in which, like a particular society engages with specific individuals. And I think the fact that I have just kind of like a strong cultural and ancestral relationship as an Indigenous Filipino person to Filipino Indigenous culture, in which third gender people were highly revered and like not considered aberrant in any way, means that I just don't have kind of like a visceral relationship to the idea of trans people being mentally ill, to the degree that I get a lot of those comments too. And I laugh at them a lot of the time, just because, like even when they're hurtful, like on a top layer, and there's this sort of like fundamental bottom layer that because of the culture that I've been shaped by, that I just can't, that would be very difficult to budge, just because of my intuitive knowledge and so many, like I know so many people back home, right? Like you have this entire tradition of people back home who are trans and are leaders and they play really important roles in our communities, et cetera, et cetera. Not that that doesn't exist here, but I just mean that when I see those people in the Philippines, I see where that, I see that they're an extrapolation of an entire sort of ancestral lineage of trans people, right? We have a question, actually. Oh, we have a couple of questions. Do you want to answer a couple of questions from our audience? What do you think? Or do you want to wait?
No, let's go with the questions.
Okay. Let's see. What are your thoughts on writing about trans joy for a cisgender audience? Can people who are not trans understand trans joy? Do they deserve to? And if not, how can we communicate that being trans is about more than just teen? I think that's a really excellent question. Cyrus, I think.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you for a second.
Okay. Do you want to start? Do you want me to start with that question?
You can start. Yeah.
Okay. Such an important question. I mean, probably in answering this, I'm gonna out myself as not. I don't even know if how much I believe in cisness. I know that lots of people experience themselves to be cis, but I also know so strongly that male and female, as biological sex identities are constructed and are the result of white supremacy and colonialism. And so I think I actually believe really strongly in sharing the spiritual, psychological, political gifts of betraying cisgender, in the hopes that more and more people will do so, because I really strongly believe that we can't end anti-Blackness, and we can't end a police and prison system, and we can't end capitalism unless we also end binary gender. And so I'm like, the more that people believe that you can live a deeply meaningful, connected, and fulfilling and spiritually rich life as a person who has rejected the gender you were assigned at birth, the better, is what I'd say to that.
Right. And that without gender assignment, there would not be either cis or trans people, right? Like we would just people. And I think and so for me, in terms of, like the idea of portraying trans joy, like so much of trans joy lies in questioning that system and, like freeing ourselves and liberating ourselves from that system. And so to a large extent, I don't really write for a cis audience in that way. I have for political reasons as a journalist, right? But in terms of, my book writing and in terms of, like the writing that I'm invested in for myself, I feel like all I really need to do is express, like how wonderful being trans is, and like and let and let and the rest can be can kind of take care of itself. I did not notice that it is now 8:46. Isn't that?
I
whoa.
know. Do we have time for one more question, or do we have to call it?
No, if you want to answer another question, please do. I will disappear myself yet again.
All right, let's just answer one last question.
Yes, go for it.
There are two on the chat.
I'm going back to the ether, so go.
I love you popping in and out.
I know. You're like a genie, Rakesh.
That's right.
Where do you find the courage to articulate your desires around sex, both the physical act and the biological designation? There are so many unwelcome spaces in our world. I try to say, normalize saying preferred pronouns in my workplace, which is a library and relatively liberal, but I'm wondering for others. So it's a slightly two-part question.
Do you want me to start again?
No, okay, I guess I can start.
Yeah.
How do I find the courage? I mean, I feel like one thing that people need to understand is that I spent a really significant amount of time not talking publicly about being trans, about, post-transition, maybe like 7 years, I was only out to a close group of people. So, so what other people perceive as courage or bravery is actually just my desire. Like I just am sick of of having to hide aspects of my identity from people, right? So for me, it doesn't feel like it requires courage or bravery, to be as honest as I am. It's a part of, just kind of like part of my life journey as somebody who wants to be understood as completely as possible for who I am, including my desires, including my recent revelation on Twitter, how attracted I am to genders that I previously had not been attracted to, to the surprise of my mom-in-law, who I think is currently on the chat. And then in terms of like making spaces more equitable or more friendly towards trans people, like I do think just being around us, right? And, like coming to things. And also I think I'm really committed to the idea that you can know about, sort of like trans rights and the principle of fighting for trans rights, but that's really different from, like from being able to embody our perspectives, from being able to care about us, right? And I feel like that's part of why, like I love my work as an author, because I communicate trans experience not just at the level of fact, but at the level of the sort of like rich textural detail.
Okay, I'll try to answer briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it feels like courage. I mean, even sharing that piece today, I was like sweating and you couldn't see me, like nervously, shaking in the back, my hands nervously shaking. It feels so vulnerable. But I think I have this feeling with writing of like, if it's not going to make me feel freaked out, what's the point of doing it or something, like if it, and I don't think that's not every writer's journey.
It's the Mary Carr School of Memoir.
There's so many writers here to do so many different types of work.
Yeah.
But I'm like, I gotta keep myself interested,
Yeah.
And the way I keep myself interested and the way it feels worth it to me is to go into my shame, to go into my fear, to go into my doubt. And I've always had, since I was a child, just a real sort of magnetic pull towards anything that isn't supposed to be said. both as a reader and then now as a writer. And that's so what shapes my experience of reading, reading work by people of many, many genders, and then also what shapes my wish to write. Yeah, I think that's the short answer. And then there was also a second part to the question about unwelcome spaces and trying to normalize things. That is something I don't have the answer to, and of course now is a more intense time for that than ever, because not only do we have to fight in institutional spaces to normalize an expansive understanding of gender, but also to normalize an understanding that anti-Blackness shapes everything, to normalize that, like in respecting the pandemic, we're also like protecting sick and elderly and vulnerable people. There's so much to fight to normalize right now. And I definitely don't know. What do you think, Meredith?
No, I mean, I think that's a good note to end on, that we all, just sort of need to fight, including, and we were going to talk about this, but we ended up not doing it, is the fact that in these types of publishing spaces, there are very, very few narratives by Black trans writers, right? And, there are more coming out. Precious Davis and Raquel Willis are both coming out with books, and of course, Janet Mock who Rakesh edited, has come out with her memoirs. But I do think that that's also something that we need to address, that we need to be instrumental in addressing within, within literary communities, which is the context that we're in. And on that note, I think we can ask Rakesh to come back.
I've been summoned like Glinda. I'm coming in a bubble back into the conversation. Thank you so much to both of you. This was such an amazing conversation, and it's such a testament to both of you as writers that you speak in as beautiful as prose as you write in. So that's an amazing thing. Meredith's memoir is Fairest. Cyrus's memoir is A Year Without a Name. I hope you will go buy them now. Please donate to lambdaliterary.org. I can't thank you both enough for being part of this. This has been such a special series. We're so grateful to you for being part of this. And thank you so much. And I wish you both safety and health during this period of time. And thank you so much for your words and your hard work. And much love to you.
Have a good night.
And safety and health to all of you in the audience, and wishing you all well,
Thank you so much. Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye.